All right, so here we are finishing up Chapter 2 of Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty. The three ideas that I missed are first Hayek's talking about how the ends of man are shaped over time by this evolutionary process of our ideas. So Hayek says that in the past, we had one set of ends, one set of things that we cared about and that we strived for. But as we learned new things, as new frontiers became possible that we never imagined before, the sort of ends that we had changed and were shaped by a society that had different beliefs about the way the world works and different beliefs about morality and things like that. Now, luckily, Hayek doesn't think that these changes are necessarily good. He just thinks that they're necessary and inevitable and have to come along with progress. But it just seems very strange to me. In one sense, one could accept this view that Hayek has and say, yeah, sure, people's ends change over time, but then add the caveat, that doesn't mean there isn't some set of objective moral standards or objective values of things that make some things better than others, and either we just haven't discovered what those values are yet, and somehow this sort of progress is going to lead us to knowing what those correct values are, or those values are the values we have now. That one would seem sort of arbitrary, or those values are the values that we would have had a long time ago, but that time has passed. One could do that and escape like the sort of subjectivism he's going for here. I'm not saying he's going for subjectivism, but the sort of subjectivism that the idea seems to imply about different values. Or one could take what I think is simply the much more reasonable response to Hayek here and simply say that he's wrong. The same things that human beings seem to care about and strive for today are the same things that we've always cared about and strived for. Human beings care about companionship with other human beings and close relationships with them. Human beings seek out not being bored. That's a driving force in a lot of human life and always has been. The fact that we're comfortable now means we seek out different ways of not being bored because it's more of a problem now, but that's always been a driving force as evidenced by cave art or as evidenced by games. Driving factors are to find meaning in life and not to live meaninglessly. And those things are just as much ends of man now as ends of man in the past. It isn't that civilizations change and our new knowledge has significantly changed our ends, Hayek. I just think you're wrong there. It's changed our means that we use to pursue the same ends we've mostly always been pursuing. And that seems to escape the sort of subjectivism that I don't think Hayek would support, but I think that is implied by this idea that over time, as we gain more knowledge as society, as we go through progress, that our ends somehow become completely different and completely unimaginable and incomprehensible to people of a different epoch. Our ideas become different, but they're not so alien because we have a completely different society, which may not be what Hayek's saying. I may be making it a little bit more extreme than it actually is. And he is certainly right that today people can talk about virtual reality and achieving that end of making workable virtual reality, whereas 200 years ago, that isn't something they would have thought of doing. So that's certainly true, is that those sort of proximal ends shift and change, but I don't think the ultimate ends do. All right, so that's one of my beefs with Hayek in this chapter, and it's one of his big points. Like point number 7, I think, in the chapter is this changing of ends over time as society progresses. Points 8 and 9, I think, are much less controversial. So point 8, he says, this argument that I'm giving in this chapter for liberty, for allowing people to do different things and compete, try out different ideas, isn't an argument against organizing people to pursue a common goal in some particular way. It's an argument against using force to compel people into organizing themselves in that particular way. As long as organizations are completely non-compulsory, as long as they're voluntary to either join and help with or not join, they're fine. They still allow this testing out of different structures in society. It's when you compel people to join them that you get rid of this ability to try different things and have this sort of competition that's necessary for society to run well. And finally, point 9, which I think is very insightful and necessary point for us to realize, is that up until the modern era, it has been almost impossible to really suppress people's freedom because you didn't have the tools necessary to do it. You didn't have the technology, and you didn't have the sort of social structures that you could use in order to press down against people so hard that they couldn't try new things, so that they couldn't communicate freely and try new ideas. You certainly had people trying, but as evidenced by the fact that we did progress despite all those people trying, it wasn't necessarily effective. And it couldn't be because they didn't have the tools. But today we do have the tools. So if we did try to crack down and did try to be oppressive, well, we could completely halt progress. We could completely stop people from trying new things, and society would stagnate and end up really rather poor. Okay, that's the end of the summary of Hayek's chapter 2. I do have some issues with this chapter, like besides even the ones I talked about with ends. And the main one is that the main mechanism that Hayek talks about for the way we use knowledge is this sort of, I think I said this in the last video, this mechanism of this evolutionary trial and error, where you imagine all of these different little cells in society, and each of them will see a problem, and they'll try to come up with a different solution to it. So you have one bubble over here trying one thing, and a different bubble over here trying a different thing. And since they're trying different things, one of them might come up with a solution, and the other one might bust. But since you've got all these different bubbles, when one of them comes up with a solution, that one will be selected, everybody else will copy it, and they'll carry through with it, and everybody else will see that. He does make these references to knowledge being contributed through prices and like expressed to other people simply because, hey, there's only one or two people in society who are making this particular good. When it becomes more difficult for them to produce that good, their cost goes up in producing it, either their cost in terms of the work they put in their labor, or the cost that goes in from who they're buying it from, or the tools they need to buy in order to do the job. And so those two or three people will all see their prices go up at the same time. And so unless they raise their prices, they'll go out of business. Since the costs are all going up together, there's not this if one of them could cut costs, they could drive the other two out of business, and society wouldn't get that information because one of them found a way around the problem. But if none of them find a way around the problem, then the information about this process becoming harder because of some change in the environment is communicated to everybody else. And that change, that information isn't given to other people by this process that Hayek mainly talks about of evolutionary selection, where somebody succeeds and somebody fails because they're all trying different things. Instead, in this case that I've given you, where everybody's prices go up because it's becoming harder, so they need to buy new, sturdier tools that will degrade less quickly because, I don't know, whatever they're working on is now spewing acid. They've all done the same thing at the same time because they've all come up with the same solution because the solution seemed obvious to them, right? Their freedom is important. Right? Hayek's not wrong about that, but he's wrong about the reason. It's not always important because people try different things and then the correct thing is selected. It's important sometimes because by allowing people to do the thing that they know is correct because they're competent and then sell their product instead of have it taken away from them, right? Because the bureaucrats don't necessarily know, oh, hey, these costs went up for this reason. The price of this should go up. Other people should have to pay more for it now, like if you're doing it bureaucratically. But if you're not doing it bureaucratically and you allow them to raise their prices, they all will do so in tandem. No of this trial and error process needed if their prices went up and they, and they want to continue making up their costs and paying for their own labor. it's not always this sort of one of them gets killed and the correct idea is selected. In many cases, they all have the correct idea, but the new knowledge is still communicated to everybody by the increase in prices. And I think that needs to be talked about a little bit more in here. I know I talked about it completely abstractly. I probably didn't do a great job of explaining it. And maybe you would get that idea more clearly from Hayek just because I'm not great at explaining it here in this video. But Hayek really needed to have more of that and less of this purely evolutionary, which is wonderful, it's a brilliant idea. But it's not the only way that knowledge is communicated throughout society. And I would have liked, and what I think we as economists do, I think one of Hayek's fundamental insights is we as economists do study prices. I'm sorry, I meant to say knowledge. We economists do study knowledge more than anything else. But what we study is how knowledge is communicated. And one of the fundamental ways it's communicated is through prices. And I really wanted this chapter to have more of that. I'm hoping I'll see more of that from future chapters in this book. All right, thanks.